the search for balance, one is most likely going to find in that search that there are things, moments, past experiences that influence in the present across time. The considerations required to perceive and attain both balance itself and as well as this, a state of balance. Throughout experience and across one's life, it is almost in one's entirety that they are subject to the consequential nature of reality, and thus maintain that in their self, as a part of a unified whole or complete self, that they begin to experience what is most often and might always be referred to as balance. What is it to be at balance? Is it to live the same day every day? For some, yes, and for others, no. It is as if each and every one of us experiences ourselves as an individual number, as part of a collective of numbers. It is the narcissist whose prime balance relies on the identification of their number, in this analogy, as being one among one, rather instead the one among many, or any other number among all. Then is it no? In the search for balance, one finds zero, and learns in this a depth of perception. It is nothing to be taken lightly, but it is also sometimes no simple thing, and therefore cannot always be heavy, at least in terms of the space retained in and by definition. In terms of perspective, there remains a distinct lack of question. Self is not this self, yet it connects. Illuminate, yet the barrier stays around. Therein, in the context of what is around, what is the question? In and out. Persistent are the clouded thoughts of the mentor. Inconsistent are the actions of the master. Subliminal in waves move the shadow from place to place, a difference in distance. A difference in distance. Then it is as if a friction to the noise, and that itself the noise of the system. Negative energy creates tension. Positive energy creates tension. That is to separate. If illuminate is to connect, then to separate is to what? Understanding each part as a part of another part, then consolidating the understanding of each connection. If this is not the purpose of the process, then instead focus therein the perception of control, the individual, the individuals, and the collision of both forces. If illuminate is to connect, then to separate is to what? Harmonize. Harmony, is it the creation of balance, or instead the extension of certainty? Then, if it is that you have explained something, then it is that there was something to explain in the first place. But it is in the self where the explanation becomes what one would call an interpretation. How does meaning differentiate from inside the mind and outside it? In and out. In the confrontation between definition and perspective, is it that it is you or I? And now it is that there is of two, as in to say that it is made up of what is and what was. Then it is that there, wherever there is, no longer represents that which was at first one. That is to subtract. Then, in a way, there is a very relative expression of what everything actually is. Now, what is a way? And what does one mean in that expression itself? There then, in that way, there is. there, then in that way there is. A very real part of relativity is that one is in a very real way an expression of another. Perhaps it is in some ways that we are all indeed a reflection of one another, in both deed and in expression, and maybe even in contradiction, a consequence of each one and another. When searching for there, sometimes it can become easy to forget to be free, to exist. But it is for true as well that sometimes to exist, one must learn to forget in order for them to experience everything as it actually is. Is it that in a way, then and there are no longer what they once were? To consider change as a part of life is to accept the notion that one cannot be what it is that they are not. But it is also, and so too, that that exact part of life is necessary. Then what is the difference between change and necessity? And to go even a little further, is it in the consequence of each individual reflection that the exact point of change is that it is a part of life, that it is necessary, is the relative expression? And then again of what everything really is. Now is a way among many, as in to say that for each expression of oneself remains the negation of one from one another. The discrepancy thus being that it is one as expression of itself, that therefore in that way of being represents that it is a consequence of the reflection, and then maybe even the connection between each. Effectually, or rather effectively, residual repetition. If this, as a form of itself, but in terms of its structure is composite only of the consequence of each reflection, then an actuality of change is once again in some way the negation of the necessary. Now there and then, here where and how, each a moment in and of itself an expression of the form of identification, but also of the abstraction that is produced by observation, but also because of implementation. And there is the implication of one thing to another. To reduce into its composite points the space occupied by each one is to produce, or rather induce, the creative presupposition that each individual cannot be reduced to its individual point or part. Preceding each reflection is what? The image, or the consequence of reflection? A better question might be that if change is a necessary part of causal reality, is it that change works only on the basis of what is effectively the and indeterminably consequential relativity of one thing because it is connected to another? To further the meditation, one might step from there, as a relative expression of time, into the subsidiary conclusion that there is no absolute relativity as of and toward what there actually is. Is there now and even then, or rather is it that there now and even then are an abstraction of one edification, that is to say, an adjustment? It is in the adjustment of perspective that often the nature of such things remains transparent. And what is the nature of such things? It is in the nature of what is that definition can render context immaterial, and that is to say, if the object of provision remains oneself, is it not then that both the remedial consequence of each is subject to that narrative? Then what is the narrative? That it is oneself, or instead that it is not? Neither subjective nor objective, performative or consequential, that is the residual repetition including itself, as to be a part of parts, or instead a wave amongst waves. In foregoing one way for another, might one decide for themselves a certain way, that way being defined by principle, the principle therefore being designed once the choice, each choice has been made. If it is that, then that is all that there is, silence in the presence of noise, but silence accompanying silence also. In this way, that becomes what it will always be. Seek not to explain the absence of noise, but instead live by it. Trust not another to understand it, but instead to observe that it is so. Then this is the first way, and to go no further would be to accept that it is. In this way, that becomes what it will always be. Seek not to explain the absence of noise, but instead live by it. Trust not another to understand it, but instead to observe that it is so. Then this is the first way, and to go no further than it would be to accept that it is. There is no force like nothing, because in the end, nothing is all that remains. Perhaps it is then to remain a part of it, rather than to part from it. An easy answer to a simple question, but it is also a difficult question too. Simple does not by definition render something easy. A simple thing can be unfair and even untrue, and there, in the foreground, is the reflection. As I see myself, so too do you see yourself. While it is no consolation, perhaps it is still a consequence, and consequences mean things are moving forward. This is the way of things, and that won't ever change. But I do understand that you would rather not mend your smile, so instead spend your time away from happiness and endeavour not to take another's away. That is all you can do. Then it is silence, and thereafter it is separation. Perhaps these two principles should take away the pain from each experience, and with time the weight should diminish. This is processing free will, instead of trying to manipulate it. The manipulation, much like the transparency in the nature of things, is a product of exponential connection and overextension. Once again, there is no force like nothing, no thing like it, because in the end, nothing is all that remains. But what is nothing? Is it something, reduced by itself, of itself, into nothing? But then that is not nothing, is it? It is something that by means of itself no longer something. That is not what nothing is. There is definition, but purpose, meaning, and even value are something else entirely. Then is it not that nothing is actually something? Time. A fascinating and yet almost objectively undescribable and inexplainable mechanism. Time is the process of measure by which mechanization is made profound, profoundly uninterpretable and yet profoundly indeterminable. It is the weight by which every and all life lives, the foundation of change, growth and decay. My name is Zane Zephyrin. Thank you for listening.